In today's video, I'm going to be reviewing the Bishop Scientific Method broadhead. It's a 2-blade single bevel broadhead. I got a couple different sizes here, a 200 grain and a 150. They make these broadheads from 100 grain all the way up through 600 grain, and the design is a little bit unique. So I'll touch over that in just a second. But essentially, you have for broadheads your expandables, you have your fixed blades. Within the fixed blades, you got your 2, 3, 4 different manufacturing methods. But within 2-blade broadhead specifically, you kind of have your double bevel heads and your single bevel heads. And where I had first kind of heard about single bevel broadheads was when I first started getting into trad a few years ago. Some guys pointed me toward the Ashby reports, and he has a whole section, a whole article basically about all the testing he had done with single bevels and how they have kind of a propensity to split bone as they go through. And one of the outputs of that Ashby article was that he had, sort of a set of recommendations for broadhead length, bevel angle, all that type of thing, steel hardness, to be able to achieve kind of the best properties of a single bevel broadhead without kind of the drawbacks that you would get from, blade chipping or tip curling and that type of thing. So to the best of my knowledge then, how these heads were developed is the guys at Bishop said, you know what, let's try and use steel that's better quality, better toughness, better resilience than what Ashby had available to him when he did his testing, and let's see if we can push this thing a little bit further. So they started with even longer heads, smaller bevel angles, which will give you a little bit sharper blade. And they basically did all the testing and said, you know what, this isn't actually performing as well as we thought it would. So they tried going the other direction. They made the blades thicker. They shortened up the heads overall, and they increased that bevel angle. And what they found was that actually performed better breaching through bone, and the heads were rotating faster. And then as a side effect of making the heads shorter and thicker and increasing that bevel angle, the edge integrity is improved. And these heads, at least the lighter grain weight ones, like the 100 to the 150, 175, these heads have a lot smaller overall profile, so they have a little bit better flight characteristics than you would get out of, say, a 300 grain on up broadhead. Which, of course, doesn't matter quite as much if you're shooting a trad bow. It matters a little bit more if you're trying to shoot these things out of a compound. And so with these heads being shorter, thicker, bigger bevel angle, that alone, from a geometry standpoint, is going to be less prone to tip curl. It's going to be more durable. The edge is going to have a little bit better integrity. It's going to last a little bit longer. You wouldn't think they would necessarily need to retain that really good high-end tool steel that they had used initially in their testing, but they decided to go with it anyway. And the end result is that these heads are just unbelievably durable. The 3 steels that you can get these broadheads in is a stainless steel. It's a proprietary alloy for them. They also have a 41L40 tool steel, which is what this broadhead is made out of. And then they have S7 tool steel, which the S in that alloy name, S7, stands for shock resisting. It's a special series of tool steels that are designed to be able to resist shock loads and impacts. And then in addition to the broadheads themselves, I also have some of the sharpening wheels that Bishop sells and their cold carbon epoxy for gluing the inserts into the arrows that I'll go over. All right, so let's look at the shape of the single bevel broadhead here. And of course, what makes it single bevel is the fact that it is only sharpened on one edge. On the other side, there is no matching bevel. So what happens when you shoot this through something is that if we look at the end of the head here, there's going to be a force from this bevel pushing against whatever it's going through, and then Newton's third law says that there's also an equal force pushing back against it. So since there's a force pushing on this side of the blade, but then there's nothing to cause resistance on the back side, you get a rotational force induced this direction. Same thing on this other side of the head. There's resistive forces on this side, but not on that side, so you get a rotation this way. And as a net result, this head will rotate as it goes through. Now, a good way to kind of conceptualize this is to think of it not as a drill bit, but as kind of a screw. So if you take a drill bit and go through a piece of wood, the depth and the rotation are independent of one another. It'll just eject material as it goes through. But with a screw, the depth and the rotation are correlated because the pitch and the design of the screw is kind of going to determine what that rotation looks like. It can only go in one way. And also, if you try and drive a screw into a piece of wood without first drilling a pilot hole, what happens? That screw creates space for itself, and oftentimes that wood will split. Same concept here with a single bevel broadhead. As it goes through something, the resistance against the head, the resistance of it going through the tissue, is causing it to rotate as it goes through. and it's creating space for itself, and in a fibrous tissue like bone, oftentimes you'll get a split. And that split kind of mobilizes the bone and causes less resistance along the rest of the shaft as it goes through. So then when I was talking about kind of the design of that bevel angle, the length of the head, thickness of the head, all that kind of determines the rotational characteristics. Similar to the screw, if you have a screw with a tighter pitch, it's going to rotate more for the same amount of depth. What Bishop has done basically with their design is they've gotten more rotation out of a shorter head like this. Now, I had gotten my 200 grain broadhead well before Sean sent me the 150s earlier this year, and one of the first things I noticed was that in just using my normal whitetail arrows with the inserts glued in with some kind of cyanoacrylate like a blue cap Gorilla Glue or a Loctite, something like that, was that the induced torque actually can very easily break free the bond of that insert. And so on this arrow right here, I lost my insert in broadhead and I had to use a threaded rod to dig back into the target and get that broadhead out. So a slow curing 2-part epoxy is definitely recommended when shooting a single bevel head. The stuff that Bishop has is a 72-hour cure, the cold carbon, and since I started using this, I haven't had really any issues with inserts coming loose, with them breaking, anything like that. The color kind of reminds me of JB Weld, but the consistency is much less viscous, and I just take my time making sure that everything's perfectly square, the broadheads are spinning smooth, and then I can set it up to cure for 3 days and not have to worry about it again. So for the bone testing, it's summer here. I really don't have access to any kind of live animals or anything like that to test. So basically what I did was I went to the grocery store and just picked out kind of the heaviest beef marrow bones that I could find on the shelf. So this is my big heavy hitting setup, and you can see on this first shot in slow-mo, the arrow pretty much drove straight through that bone. And when you see I go to pick it up and the thing's just split right in half, and not only that, but the arrow pretty much continued to go on straight through and well into the target. So it still had plenty of momentum and kinetic energy after kind of splitting that bone top to bottom. Now, I realize this test setup isn't perfect, main reason being the bone isn't perfectly fixtured. Like in an actual animal, the bone is surrounded by connective tissue and muscle that kind of holds it in place. But with this test setup, as soon as the arrow makes contact, it can kind of tip that bone, and I think that kind of deviates the arrow's angle more so than what in an actual animal. So like what you saw in that shot right there is you actually saw the angle of the arrow deviate a little bit as it went to the target, and that put a ton of extra stress on that arrow, even though the broadhead pretty much still had no issues going through the bone. So it's more of an arrow torture test. And for this last one here, I basically just put out 3 chunks of that bone, all stacked right in front of another. So this one is definitely the hardest torture test on the arrow. So the broadhead had no problem just kind of splitting and going through whatever was there. But you can see that arrow, when it hit the target, basically as it was penetrating at an angle, so that induced flex in the arrow just got sharper and sharper as it penetrated, and it was twisting at the same time because it's single bevel. So that arrow actually broke right where it stopped entering into the target. So I'm just taking that broken shaft and ton of wobble. So like the wobble from the broadhead, did the ferrule bend or was it all in the insert? I'll just take that broadhead and put it on a different shaft. And it spins beautifully. So broadhead's totally fine. It was just a bent insert. And again, I'm not really blaming the arrow. I mean, I think the test setup is kind of prone to having some really goofy things happen with the arrow. Now this shot, I did it with my longbow, so less than half the kinetic energy and a little over half of the momentum with this setup. So what you can see basically is I didn't get a clean hit on the center of that bone. I kind of went through the side. So in order for this thing to actually penetrate, it would have needed to go through like almost 2 inches of bone. And that bone is roughly as thick as my finger is in diameter. But you can see a split on the bottom, split on the top. So I'm assuming that it probably split that bone top to bottom, even though it really didn't penetrate. Again, at this distance of that shot, that arrow is still in paradox as well. One thing that's interesting here is that that arrow is actually really easy to remove from the bone. So I've found in the past that if I'm trying to remove like a field point or a 3-blade broadhead or something like that from a piece of wood or a piece of bone, usually it gets really wedged in there, but that wasn't the case with this, and I think it's because when it kind of splits that bone, it kind of creates space. So it's pretty easy to actually remove that broadhead, and that could, you know, as you penetrate, reduce the amount of friction on the rest of the shaft, which is kind of what Ashby, had talked about in some of his reports. So I'm just going to cut away some of the connective tissue and flesh around the bones to see what kind of damage that head actually did. Basically did split that bone top to bottom. I also just want to point out here too that just having like one component, like one great single bevel broadhead alone isn't going to be like a magic pill. Obviously that longbow had a lot less momentum than the compound did. And that compound, even though that arrow was flying all over the place, it still had much more penetration and kind of bone breaking potential. You know, so all these kind of factors, momentum, the amount of energy that you're storing in your bow, arrow mass, front to center, good components, great arrow flight, all those things, you know, combined give you the penetration. And so I kept shooting my longbow at these beef neck bones just to try and get some more data and just kind of analyze what happens when it hits what. Some of the bones that were hit were real thin segments like this one, and the broadhead had no problem splitting through. Other shots, like this one right here, it hit a really heavy piece of that bone, and you can see as I pull this arrow away from the target, the broadhead actually didn't even go through. So there's a really heavy piece of bone, which is nice from the standpoint of I know that my test is testing the limits truly, because I am getting some failures. But you can see even though it didn't go through, there was still a crack all the way on the back side, which is again what those single bevels are so often touted to do well at. And you can see this is the broadhead after doing all of this bone shooting. One of the things that really impresses me about these heads is they just take a beating and still look like they haven't even been used. For additional durability testing, you can check out Mind Like the Mill Pond on YouTube. He's done some tests with the Bishop single bevel broadheads, shooting them from a crossbow into cinder blocks like we got right here. And then Lusk Archery Adventures on YouTube has also done a lot of testing on the Bishop stuff. And then, of course, for testing this stuff into animals, the Ranch Fairy YouTube channel, which is done by Troy Fowler. He's got some great videos where he'll shoot stuff right into pigs and then go ahead and cut them open and show the autopsy.
The blade knocked a huge chunk out of it. You see that hole again through the top of the spine. You see how mobile that bone is from being shattered by the single bevel.
So single bevel broadheads, these are no exception. They can be sharpened in many different ways. They can be hand sharpened using stones. Sean did send me some of the wheels, the sharpening wheels that Bishop sells. So basically there's a grinding wheel on the left that uses like 150 grit carbide, and that's what I'm using on this left wheel here. Basically just running that head with real light strokes, matching that bevel as best as I can until I feel a burr on the back side of that bevel. Once I feel that burr, then it's time to switch over to the slotted wheel. So I rub some Rogue on that slotted wheel, and then the first thing I want to do is take off that little burr on the back side of the bevel. So as flat as I can get it to the back side of that blade, really light pressure, I work off that burr with a light swipe, and then just go right along the bevel again, and just kind of go back and forth, one stroke each way, just a couple times, and then we'll take a look at what the head actually looks like at this point. Right, so we got pretty much a mirror finish on that blade. That does take some practice to get those wheels down. You can screw up a blade if you don't really know what you're doing. But you can see here, I know it's obviously hard to see. I don't have much arm hair, but it's coming off pretty easily. No problem shaving that arm hair off. You know, like one of the concerns with a big bevel angle like that 40-degree bevel, is that it's not as sharp as, say, like a 25-degree. But, clearly it's sharp enough, at least in my opinion. And moreover, that larger bevel is going to help retain its sharpness better than a smaller bevel would. In shooting my trad bows, it seems like I can get away with a little bit more surface area on a broadhead because the wind planing isn't as big of a factor with the slower arrow speeds. But I did want to point out this one shot that I took a video of. Basically, the fletch comes off right when I release. And you can see that despite the fact that that arrow is now flying downrange with 2 feathers, that arrow still has good flight all the way to the target 25 yards away. I'm just taking a couple shots here with the compound, 40 yards, which, I mean, for whitetail guys, hog hunters, I mean, this is like probably, what, 90% of whitetails are shot within this range. I really try to stay away from saying that anything is like field point accurate, because you could probably take a hooter shooter at some arbitrary range and go further and further out until you can prove that a field point is more aerodynamic and accurate. So what I'm just kind of doing is I test, the broadheads, how they shoot when I'm actually shooting them at hunting ranges, hunting distances, and if they aren't noticeably worse group-wise than with the field points, I'm not getting any erratic flyers, then that's pretty much good enough for me. And here's kind of your more typical range. I mean, a lot of whitetails, I believe, are shot under 25 yards every year. So there's some other YouTube videos that show these broadheads being shot at much longer ranges. Mine, like the Mill Pond, has some absurdly long shooting videos with these single bevels. And then the Bishop Archery channel, I think, is kind of a response to people who think you can't shoot heavy broadheads at long ranges, has quite a bit of shooting videos where you're shooting over 100 yards out of a compound as well. So when you kind of look at how these broadheads are designed, the thick blades, the larger bevel angles, and then combine that with the construction that's machined one-piece high-end tool steel, I honestly don't think there's anything on the market that could compare in terms of overall durability and longevity of these heads, provided you don't lose them out in the woods. Like some other machined heads on the market, these things come with a lifetime replacement guarantee. I think you'd have to do something really crazy in order to actually get these broadheads damaged to the point where they would need to be replaced. And with the durability that these broadheads come with, they're basically not going to be the weakest link in your system. If something does fail, it's going to be an insert bending, it's going to be the arrow shaft cracking or breaking. You don't really have to worry about the broadhead, and there's a certain amount of confidence that comes with that. Now, how much durability do you need in a broadhead? That's something I'll kind of leave up to you guys to answer for yourselves. People hunt different things for different reasons. A guy who's hunting his grandpa's back 40 to put a couple deer in the freezer every year is likely going to have a different opinion than a guy who's dropping $20,000 to go hunt dangerous game in Africa. These broadheads do come at a very premium price, and for that reason, only a small number of people are probably going to even look at affording some of these broadheads. But that being said, I don't think Bishop's intention here is to sell millions of broadheads. I think their intention here is to create their perfect broadhead with zero compromises in the manufacturing, in the materials chosen, and that kind of decision making for a product is always going to have some subset of the market that's willing to pay the cost. It's just kind of, you see that in various other industries. People are buying $5,000 mountain bikes and whatnot. But I think the main point is here, I think the broadheads pretty much speak for themselves. It's just a matter of, whether or not it's worth it to you. So that's obviously a question I can't answer for you. In terms of when I would use these broadheads, I had done a review on the 3-blade Holy Trinity broadhead, and I made a statement at the end of that video that I said I was going to be using that arrow for deer hunting this fall out of my compound. And these little guys, these 150 grainers, they make a really strong, compelling argument for me to want to shoot those instead of the 3-blade ones. So I haven't 100% decided yet. I think I might still stick with the 3-blade just because I know it's still going to blow through anything with that compound that I got. You don't need much to shoot through a deer with a 70-pound compound or 29.5-inch draw. So where this is going to make a difference is if I do, hit bone or something like that. And I still think that even that other setup, just because I got so much momentum in that setup, it still shouldn't have much of an issue. One of the guys that I think, if this is interesting to you, go check out the Ranch Fairy, because Troy is a guy who literally has put hundreds of arrows through hogs, and he's guiding, people all the time on his ranch down in Texas. And he's taken detailed notes on arrow weights, broadhead types, all that kind of stuff. And what he's finding is that when you have a heavy arrow, decent front of center, you've got decent enough arrow flight that you can actually obviously hit what you're aiming at, and you have a heavy single bevel broadhead, he's finding that on smaller hogs and deer sized game, it really opens up your shot window. The guys are taking quartering 2 shots intentionally, aiming right through the shoulder and taking out the top of the heart. Shot placement that you would never advise shooting, lighter arrows and expandable broadheads, or even fixed blade broadheads, with 3 or 4 blades. But it's very interesting, and if you want to hear more about it, we did a podcast with Troy. There's a lot of good information in that. So that being said, outside of the compound world, which a lot of us are in, kind of the 60, 70 pound draw weight type of stuff, the lower you get in draw weight, the lower you get in momentum, guys that are shooting trad, or if you have short draw, low poundage archers, the less momentum you're putting out in the arrow, the more a 2-blade broadhead can help you in terms of getting the penetration that you need. I think there was a picture on Bishop's website where they showed a shoulder blade that had been shot with like a 14-pound bow, and it was able to still poke through that shoulder just a little bit and crack it. I wouldn't advise shooting intentionally at a bone with a low poundage. But anyways, I hope this video was helpful, helped shed some light on some of these broadheads and some of these products. So if you have any additional questions, please leave them in the comments down below. Thanks for watching.